There is a substance that America cannot live without. It is not oil, it is not steel, it is not rare earth minerals or semiconductor chips or advanced batteries. It is potash. And 87% of it comes from Canada. Every cornfield in Iowa, every wheat farm in Kansas, every soybean operation in Illinois, every fruit orchard in California, every vegetable grower in Florida, every cotton plantation in Texas. None of them grow without potash. It is the third major plant nutrient after nitrogen and phosphorus, and it is irreplaceable. There is no synthetic substitute. There is no alternative formulation. Without potassium, plants cannot transport water, cannot activate enzymes, cannot resist disease. Their stalks weaken, their yields collapse, their quality deteriorates. And the United States, the world's largest agricultural exporter, the nation that prides itself on feeding the planet, mines almost none of it. Canada holds the world's largest reserves, 1.1 billion tons of potassium oxide equivalent, 5 times larger than American deposits, 36 times more production volume. 41% of global exports, 11 active mines in Saskatchewan, 6 owned by one company, Nutrien, the world's largest potash producer, 14.4 million metric tons sold in 2024 to more than 40 countries. And in February 2025, President Donald Trump looked at this supply chain, this deep structural, irreplaceable dependency, and decided the appropriate response was a 25% tariff. Not on Chinese EVs, not on European steel, on Canadian fertilizer, on the thing American farmers cannot grow without. And today we're not talking about fighter jets or LNG terminals. We're talking about dirt, about the potassium chloride crystals that flow from Saskatchewan mines into American soil, into American crops, into American grocery stores. We're talking about the single most one-sided trade relationship between the United States and any major partner. And we're talking about what happens when the country holding the cards finally realizes it's been holding them all along. This is the story of potash. And it may be the story of how America's farmers became collateral damage in a trade war they never wanted. Let's start with geology. Potash deposits are not evenly distributed across the Earth's crust. They are the remnants of ancient inland seas, evaporated, compressed, buried beneath layers of sediment over millions of years. Canada's potash belt lies beneath the Saskatchewan prairie, a vast shallow formation that is among the richest and most accessible on Earth. America's potash deposits are in Utah, New Mexico, and Michigan. They are not enough. Not by volume, not by quality, not by economics. The U.S. Geological Survey is blunt about this. Domestic production meets less than 15% of American demand. The remaining 85%, actually closer to 90% for imported potash specifically, comes from across the northern border. And the alternative suppliers? Belarus, Russia. 2 countries under comprehensive Western sanctions. 2 countries whose supply chains are entangled with war crimes investigations, oligarch networks, and geopolitical blackmail. 2 countries the United States has spent 3 years trying to economically isolate. Even if American buyers wanted to pivot to these sources, and they don't, the logistics are prohibitive. Russian and Belarusian potash flows through Baltic ports controlled by NATO members who have imposed their own restrictions. The reputational risk alone is untenable for major agricultural conglomerates. There is no plan B. This is not a vulnerability. This is a structural inevitability. The United States does not have enough potash. It cannot produce enough potash. It cannot import enough potash from anywhere except Canada at scale, at quality, at price points that keep American agriculture competitive in global markets. And now, a 25% tariff has turned that structural inevitability into a self inflicted tax. Let's be clear about how tariffs actually function in the potash market. Unlike some commodities where sellers absorb part of the cost to maintain market share, potash pricing operates on global benchmarks. When Canada's potash exports to the United States are subject to a 25% tariff, that cost does not get absorbed by Nutrien or Mosaic or any of the Saskatchewan producers. It gets passed directly to American farmers. The numbers are not theoretical. December 2024, U.S. import price index for chemical fertilizers sits at 164.5. September 2025, 186.5, a 13% increase in less than a year. The prices paid index for U.S. farmers, 139.9 in June 2024, 149.9 in June 2025, a 7% increase driven primarily by fertilizer costs. Potash itself, approximately $450 per ton. In early 2025. Full pass-through of a 25% tariff adds more than $100 per ton for Canadian source supply. Now multiply that by the millions of tons American farmers apply every year. Corn farmers. Fertilizer represents 45% of operating expenses. Not total costs, operating expenses. The variable inputs that determine whether a season ends in profit or loss. Soybeans, similar exposure. Wheat, similar exposure. Cotton, potatoes, alfalfa, fruits, vegetables. Every crop that requires potassium fertilization is now more expensive to grow in the United States than anywhere else in North America. Josh Linville, Vice President of Fertilizer at StoneX Group, puts it directly. Unlike some other tariffs where the seller bears the brunt of the cost, potash exports are different. Canada holds the cards in this supply relationship. Domestic U.S. production cannot fill the gap. Bob Thompson, president of the Michigan Farmers Union. Any added costs brought by tariffs are passed down to individual farmers. Farmers have no way of recouping that cost typically because crops are sold at the whim of whatever the market is rather than allowing farmers to set their own price. Bill Knudsen, agricultural economist at Michigan State University. Tariffs inevitably push the price of potash up and farm profits down. Just about any crop uses potash in some ways, so that is going to reduce profitability. This is not a trade war. This is a tax on American agriculture. And unlike most taxes, this one does not fund roads, schools, or defense. It funds nothing except the political ego of an administration that did not understand the supply chain it was weaponizing. In December 2025, President Trump announced he is considering severe tariffs on Canadian fertilizer imports to boost U.S. production. The USDA claims it has a plan to reshore fertilizer manufacturing. This plan does not exist, not in any operational sense, not on any timeline relevant to American farmers facing their third consecutive year of declining corn prices. Let's examine the proposed alternatives. Michigan's Osceola County Potash Mine, a project that could eventually produce 800,000 tons per year, approximately 7% of current U.S. import requirements. It depends on a $1.1 billion federal loan that received conditional approval in January 2025. Conditional. Not funded, not constructed, not producing. Even if approved today, even if construction began tomorrow, even if every regulatory hurdle vanished, we are years away from a single ton of Michigan potash reaching American soil. Years, during which Canadian potash continues to flow, continues to be taxed, continues to raise costs for American farmers who cannot wait. Nitrogen fertilizer expansion. The The USDA emphasizes potential growth in domestic nitrogen production. This is a category error. Nitrogen is not potash. They are different nutrients derived from different minerals produced through different industrial processes. Nitrogen fertilizer requires natural gas. Potash requires mining. You cannot substitute one for the other. Crops need both. The USDA knows this. The Fertilizer Institute knows this. Every farmer in America knows this. But acknowledging it would require admitting that the emperor has no clothes. Joe Jansen, agricultural economist at the University of Illinois. It may be possible for the U.S. to expand its production of nitrogen fertilizer, but that may not benefit farmers because any rise in U.S. fertilizer output that is propelled by tariffs would mean producers in that country are being protected from cheaper foreign imports. For farmers, all of that would raise costs. This is the paradox of tariff-driven industrial policy. You cannot protect domestic producers from foreign competition without raising costs for domestic consumers. In potash, the domestic consumers are American farmers, and the domestic producers don't exist. While Washington debates tariffs and loan guarantees, Canada is doing something quietly devastating, expanding. BHP's Johnson Potash project in Saskatchewan, the largest new potash mine in decades, begins production in 2026. Not hypothetical, not conditional, under construction, on schedule, staffed, funded, and committed. $40 billion in capital investment, thousands of construction jobs, hundreds of permanent operating positions, multi-decade production capacity. And here's the detail that should terrify American agricultural strategists. Johnson's offtake agreements are global. Yes, BHP will sell to the United States. It already has long-term customers there. But its commercial strategy is not American dependent. It is market diversified. Asia, Latin America, Europe. The same customers Canada has been systematically cultivating for other commodities, LNG, aluminum, critical minerals, aerospace components, are now being offered long-term potash supply contracts. This is the pattern we have documented across this entire series. Every time Washington imposes tariffs, threatens supply chains, or dismisses Canadian economic sovereignty, Ottawa does not retaliate emotionally. It diversifies, not through dramatic confrontations, through quiet, methodical, irreversible contracts. Ships loaded with Saskatchewan potash bound for Shanghai instead of New Orleans. Trains carrying Canadian fertilizer to Pacific ports instead of Midwest distribution hubs. Long-term supply agreements with Brazilian agribusiness instead of Illinois cooperatives. And once those contracts are signed, once those shipping routes are established, once those commercial relationships mature, they do not reverse. You don't cancel a 10-year supply agreement with the Brazilian soy cooperative because the U.S. tariff rate drops from 25% to 10%. You don't reroute vessels already at sea because the ambassador in Ottawa issues a conciliatory statement. Once the flow diversifies, the flow stays diversified. Here's the irony that seems to escape everyone in Washington. President Trump, while threatening tariffs on Canadian potash, continues to publicly muse about Canada becoming the 51st state. This is not just diplomatic malpractice, it is strategic incoherence. If Canada is to become the 51st state, why are you taxing its exports to the United States? If Canada is an integral part of the American economic sphere, why are you imposing trade barriers between its producers and your consumers? If Canada is a dependent satellite of American power, why are you actively incentivizing it to diversify its customer base away from you? The tariffs do not align with the rhetoric, and the market has noticed. Every Canadian potash executive, every logistics manager, Every supply chain strategist has absorbed the same lesson. Dependence is vulnerability, diversification is security. The United States is Canada's largest potash customer. That will remain true for the foreseeable future. Geography, infrastructure, and historic commercial relationships ensure a continuing flow of Saskatchewan crystals southward. But the margin is now contested. Every ton diverted to Asia, to Latin America, to Europe is a ton that cannot be taxed. Every contract signed with a non American buyer is a hedge against future tariff escalations. Every shipment through Prince Rupert or Vancouver instead of Minnesota or North Dakota is a permanent reduction in American leverage. And here is the question no one in Washington is asking. If Canada can diversify 10% of its potash exports away from the United States, why not 20%? Why not 30%? Why not 50%? What is the ceiling on this process? And what happens when American farmers, already struggling with 3 years of declining corn prices and escalating input costs, suddenly face supply competition from Asian buyers willing to pay global market rates? The answer is not theoretical. It is already unfolding. The tariffs are not just taxing American farmers. They are teaching Canada that the United States is an unreliable customer. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. Nutrien, the world's largest potash producer, 6 operating mines in Saskatchewan, 14.4 million metric tons sold in 2024, customers in more than 40 countries. Nutrien is a Canadian company, but its ownership is global. Its shares trade on the Toronto Stock Exchange and the New York Stock Exchange. Its investors include major American pension funds, institutional asset managers, and retail shareholders. Nutrien does not want a trade war. Tariffs disrupt its largest market. They create uncertainty for its American customers. They complicate its long-term investment planning. But Nutrien is also a rational actor. And rational actors, when faced with an unpredictable customer that imposes unilateral taxes on their products, diversify their customer base. This is not retaliation. This is not nationalism. This is fiduciary responsibility. Nutrien's management has a legal and ethical obligation to maximize shareholder value. If the American market becomes less reliable, less profitable, more subject to political whims, they must find alternative buyers. BHP's Johnson project, beginning production in 2026, is not owned by Nutrien. It is a competitor. But its commercial logic applies equally to both companies. Global demand for potash is growing. Population growth. Dietary shifts toward higher protein foods. Declining soil fertility in traditional agricultural regions. All of these trends point toward increased potash consumption over the next decade. The United States is not the only country that needs to feed itself. China needs potash. India needs potash. Brazil needs potash. Indonesia, Vietnam, Nigeria, Pakistan, all of them need potash. And all of them are willing to sign long-term contracts at market prices. The United States is no longer the only customer in town. Here is where the timeline becomes critical. 2026. BHP's Johnson mine begins production. LNG Canada's second phase reaches final investment decision. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion operates at full capacity. Canada's fighter decision, F-35 or Gripen or hybrid, reaches its conclusion. The U.S. presidential election cycle enters its most volatile phase. And American farmers face another spring planting season, with potash prices elevated by tariffs that have now been in place for over a year. This is the convergence point. Not a single dramatic rupture, a cumulative compounding erosion of the structural dependencies that have defined Canada-US economic relations for generations. every commodity we have examined in this series. Aluminum, energy, aerospace, defense, now agriculture, follows the same arc: dependency, erosion, diversification, irreversibility. Potash is the latest and, in some ways, the most significant because it touches something no other commodity does: food, not manufacturing, not electricity, not national defense, the literal sustenance of the American population. Yes, most potash is used for export crops: corn, soybeans, wheat, sold to global markets. But those exports generate farm income that sustains rural communities, supports agricultural supply chains, and maintains the economic viability of American agriculture. And a significant portion of domestically consumed food, dairy, meat, processed goods, depends indirectly on potash fertilized feed grains. You cannot tariff your way to food security. You cannot tax the essential inputs of your own agricultural sector and expect that sector to remain globally competitive. You cannot threaten your sole reliable supplier of an irreplaceable resource and expect that supplier to maintain exclusive commercial focus on your market. The tariffs have already failed. They have not increased domestic U.S. potash production. They have not reduced American dependence on Canadian imports. They have not generated sustainable government revenue, because every dollar collected in tariffs is a dollar extracted from American farmers. They have only achieved one thing: they have convinced Canada that the United States is an unreliable partner. And that conviction, once embedded, does not dissolve when tariff rates adjust or administrations change. It becomes doctrine. So, where does this leave American agriculture? More vulnerable than it was before the tariffs were imposed. Not less. More. Because Canada is now actively, systematically, permanently diversifying its potash customer base. Because every new contract signed with Brazil, with India, with Southeast Asia is a contract that reduces the share of Canadian production available for the American market. Because in the next supply disruption, whether caused by weather, labor disputes, transportation bottlenecks, or another round of trade escalation, the United States will no longer be Canada's only priority customer. It will be one priority among many. And American farmers, already operating on thin margins, facing 3 years of declining commodity prices and absorbing tariff-inflated input costs, will have to compete with global buyers for access to a resource that was once assumed to flow south automatically. This is not alarmism. This is arithmetic. Canadian potash production capacity is finite. Even with Johnson and other expansions, supply cannot increase infinitely to satisfy every market simultaneously. When you have more customers than product, you allocate. And when you allocate, you prioritize customers who have demonstrated reliability, predictability, and partnership, not customers who impose unilateral taxes on your exports. The message from Ottawa to Washington, delivered not through diplomatic notes but through commercial contracts and shipping manifests, is consistent across every sector we have examined. We will cooperate with you. We will integrate with you. We will defend the continent with you. But we will no longer be dependent on you. And if that means American farmers pay more for fertilizer, American factories pay more for aluminum, American utilities pay more for electricity, American air forces operate with reduced interoperability, that is not Canada's problem. It is the consequence of 75 years of assumed partnership being replaced by 5 years of transactional coercion. There is a photograph that every Canadian agricultural economist knows. It shows a line of railway cars stretching across the Saskatchewan prairie, loaded with potash bound for the United States. For generations, that image represented something comfortable, the natural, inevitable, unexamined flow of resources from north to south, sustaining American farms and Canadian mines, in mutual, unquestioned interdependence. That photograph is now historical. The trains still run, the potash still flows. American farmers still depend on Canadian fertilizer, but the assumption is gone. The comfortable, unexamined certainty that Canada would always be there, always supply, always prioritize the American customer above all others. That certainty has been replaced by something colder. Calculation. Every ton of potash loaded onto a rail car, destined for the United States, is now weighed against alternative markets. Every contract is examined for its long-term strategic implications. Every shipment is evaluated through the lens of diversification, resilience, and sovereign capacity. Canada is not ceasing to supply the United States. Canada is ceasing to depend on the United States. And that distinction, invisible in trade statistics and diplomatic communiques, is the most significant shift in North American economic relations since the Auto Pact of 1965. American farmers did not ask for this. They did not vote for tariffs on the fertilizer they cannot live without. They did not choose to become collateral damage in a trade war they never understood and cannot influence. But they are the ones who will pay the price, in higher costs, in thinner margins, in lost competitiveness, in the quiet, cumulative erosion of the American agricultural advantage that has fed the world for a century. And when the next supply disruption comes, not if, but when. And Canadian potash shipments are allocated to customers in Sao Paulo and Mumbai, before customers in Des Moines and Fresno. Remember that it did not have to be this way. Remember that the tariffs were a choice. And remember that Canada, once taught the lesson that dependence is vulnerability, does not unlearn it. What do you think? Can the United States ever rebuild domestic potash production capacity to reduce Canadian dependence? Or is American agriculture now permanently exposed to the strategic consequences of a trade war it never wanted? Will Canada's global diversification accelerate, or will geography and infrastructure keep the majority of potash flowing south? And what does this mean for food prices at your local grocery store? Let me know in the comments. If you want to track these agricultural and geopolitical shifts before they become headlines, hit subscribe and ring the bell. We're watching the signals the rest of the world misses.